When we open the pages of the Bible, few names evoke as much fear and fascination as the Philistines. They emerge from the shadows of history as menacing giants, iron-clad warriors wielding advanced weapons, relentless enemies of God's chosen people. But who were these mysterious adversaries who challenged Samson, captured the Ark of the Covenant, and sent the formidable Goliath to face the armies of Israel? Imagine a seafaring people arriving with unknown technologies and foreign customs, establishing powerful cities along the coasts of Canaan. Their temples housed strange gods. Their fortresses seemed impregnable. For centuries, they were the scourge of Israel, a constant threat to the survival and identity of God's people. Today, the term Philistine still resonates in modern Middle Eastern conflicts. But is there any real connection between the ancient iron-wielding warriors and the current inhabitants of the region? The sands of time hold secrets that archaeology is only now beginning to uncover. Prepare for a journey through the centuries, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the battlefields of Israel, as we unravel the mystery of the greatest biblical enemies of God's chosen people and discover what became of this lost civilization, buried in the dust of history. In the pages of the Bible and ancient historical records, we find a people who posed the most persistent threat to Israel, the Philistines. To understand who these feared adversaries were, we must go back in time to the era of the Great Migrations that swept across the Mediterranean around 1200 BC. The Philistines were part of a broader migratory movement known as the Sea Peoples. These groups came from the Aegean and Anatolian regions, bringing with them a distinct culture that stood out among the native inhabitants of Canaan. Both biblical and archaeological evidence point to Kaftor, identified as the island of Crete, as the Philistines' place of origin. This is confirmed in the Bible itself, where in Amos 9:7 the Lord declares, "Did I not bring Israel up from the land of Egypt and the Philistines from Kaftor?" These migrants did not spread randomly across Canaan. On the contrary, they strategically settled along the southwestern coast, in a fertile strip of land known as the coastal plain of Canaan. This region became known as Philistia, or, as some scholars prefer, the Philistine Pentapolis, referring to the 5 major cities that formed the core of their territory. These 5 cities, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron, constituted a political and military confederation. Each city was governed by a leader called a serin, plural, seranim, a term found in the Bible that has no equivalent in local Semitic languages, suggesting it was an imported title from their original culture. This confederation of city-states provided the Philistines with an efficient political organization and a unified military capability, making them formidable opponents. What made the Philistines so distinct and feared among the peoples of Canaan? A crucial factor was their mastery of iron metallurgy. While the Israelites and other Canaanite peoples were still primarily using bronze for their tools and weapons, the Philistines brought with them the technology to forge iron, giving them a significant military advantage. This technological monopoly was so important that the Philistines even forbade the Israelites from having blacksmiths, as we will see later. The Philistine armies were remarkably well organized for their time. They had war chariots, advanced armor, and professional soldiers. The most famous example of their military superiority is undoubtedly the giant Goliath, described in the Bible as a towering Philistine warrior fully equipped with scale armor, a bronze helmet, a breastplate, and advanced weaponry. Beyond military superiority, the Philistines also introduced a distinct material culture. Archaeology reveals that their pottery was noticeably different from that of the local peoples. Their Bikram pottery, decorated in black and red with geometric and spiral motifs, clearly reflects their origins in the Aegean world and set them apart from the native Canaanites. Their dietary habits were also different, including the consumption of pork, which was uncommon among the Semitic peoples of the region. The Philistines worshipped a pantheon of deities that incorporated both elements from their homeland and gods adopted from local cultures. Among their main deities were Dagon, the grain god, whose temple in Gaza was the setting for Samson's dramatic final act, Astarte, the goddess of fertility, and Baal-zebub, lord of the flies, worshipped in Ekron and later referenced in the New Testament as Beelzebub. Philistine cities were notably advanced in terms of architecture and urban planning. They built imposing fortifications, temples, and palaces that reflected influences from both the Mediterranean and Egypt. Archaeological excavations at sites such as Tel Mikne, ancient Ekron, and Ashdod have uncovered complex urban structures, including industrial facilities for large-scale olive oil production. The arrival of the Philistines on the coast of Canaan was not a peaceful process. During their migration through the eastern Mediterranean, the Sea Peoples, including the Philistines, clashed directly with the Egyptian Empire, which was then ruled by Pharaoh Rameses III. In the 8th year of his reign, approximately 1175 BC, Rameses III had to confront a massive invasion by these groups, as documented in the impressive reliefs of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. These reliefs depict naval and land battles against invaders wearing feathered helmets and other distinctive gear. Rameses III managed to defeat this threat, but the effort was immense and marked the beginning of Egypt's decline in the region. Some scholars suggest that after these battles, Egypt allowed groups of Philistines to settle along the Canaanite coast as a buffer state against future invasions. For a time, the Philistines likely served as vassals of Egypt before establishing full independence. As Egyptian power waned in the region, the Philistines consolidated their control over the coastal plain and expanded their influence. Over time, they developed important trade routes linking Egypt to Mesopotamia, becoming valuable intermediaries in the international commerce of the era. The first significant encounters between the Israelites and the Philistines occurred during the period of the Judges, approximately between the 12th and 11th centuries BCE. It was a time of political instability for Israel when there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes, as stated in the book of Judges. This political fragmentation made the Israelites particularly vulnerable to Philistine military pressure. The conflict between these two peoples intensified as the Israelites, initially settled in the central mountainous region of Canaan, began expanding toward the coastal plains dominated by the Philistines. Territorial disputes were inevitable, especially since the Philistines controlled the best agricultural lands in the region. The story of Samson, narrated in Judges chapters 13 to 16, marks one of the first major direct conflicts between the Israelites and the Philistines. Born as a Nazirite, consecrated to God before his birth, Samson was designated to begin to deliver Israel from the hand of the Philistines. His feats against the Philistines included killing a lion with his bare hands, defeating 30 men in Ashkelon, setting Philistine fields on fire using foxes with torches tied to their tails, and slaying 1,000 Philistines with a donkey's jawbone. However, Samson's weakness for Philistine women, first his wife from Timnah and later Delilah, led to his downfall. Betrayed by Delilah, who discovered the secret of his strength in his uncut hair, Samson was captured, had his eyes gouged out, and was taken to Gaza to serve as a slave and a public spectacle. In a final act of strength, during a celebration at the Temple of Dagon, Samson pulled down the central pillars of the building, killing more Philistines in his death than he had in his lifetime. Despite Samson's individual exploits, Israel's overall situation continued to deteriorate under Philistine pressure. In a decisive battle at Aphek, narrated in 1 Samuel chapter 4, the Philistines inflicted a devastating defeat on Israel. Thousands of Israelites perished, including the sons of the priest Eli, and the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred symbol of God's presence among the Israelites, was captured. The capture of the ark dealt a severe blow to Israel's faith and morale. However, as narrated in 1 Samuel chapters 5 and 6, while the ark remained in Philistine territory, strange misfortunes began to occur. In Ashdod, the statue of Dagon was found fallen and broken before the ark. Then, the inhabitants of Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron were afflicted with tumors and plagues. After 7 months of these troubling events, the Philistines decided to return the ark to Israel, sending it on a cart drawn by cows, along with golden offerings. Even after the ark was returned, the Philistines maintained oppressive control over Israel. They imposed strict technological restrictions, forbidding the Israelites from manufacturing or possessing iron weapons and tools. In 1 Samuel 13:19-22 we read, "Now there was no blacksmith to be found throughout all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, 'Lest the Hebrews make swords or spears for themselves.' So all the Israelites had to go down to the Philistines, to sharpen each man his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, and his sickle. On the day of battle, neither sword nor spear was found in the hand of any of the people. It was under the leadership of the prophet and judge Samuel that Israel began to organize an effective resistance against Philistine domination. Samuel gathered the people at Mizpah for a time of repentance and spiritual renewal. The Philistines, interpreting this assembly as a prelude to rebellion, marched against the gathered Israelites. In 1 Samuel chapter 7, we read, "When the Philistines heard that the children of Israel had gathered at Mizpah, the rulers of the Philistines went up against Israel. Facing this threat, Samuel offered a sacrifice to God and cried out for divine intervention. During the ensuing battle, the Lord thundered with a great thunder on that day upon the Philistines and confused them so that they were defeated before Israel. This battle, known as the Battle of Ebenezer, Stone of Help, marked a significant turning point in the conflict with the Philistines. Following this victory, Samuel established a period of relative peace. The cities which the Philistines had taken from Israel were restored to Israel, from Ekron to Gath. Israel delivered its territory from the hand of the Philistines. This period saw the establishment of more defined borders between Israelite and Philistine territory, though the Philistine threat never completely disappeared. The constant Philistine military pressure was one of the main factors that led Israel to demand a king. The system of judges, with its intermittent and decentralized leadership, proved insufficient to face an enemy as organized and technologically advanced as the Philistines. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, when the people asked Samuel to appoint a king, one of the primary reasons given was, "We want to be like the other nations, with a king to lead us and go out before us to fight our battles." Beyond the military threat, the Philistines also posed a challenge to Israel's cultural and religious identity. Their dominant presence in the plains and control over trade routes exposed the Israelites to pagan religious and cultural practices, exerting constant pressure for assimilation. The temptation to adopt Canaanite and Philistine customs would remain an ongoing struggle for Israel throughout its history. The Philistine threat was a decisive factor in the choice of Israel's first king. Saul, a tall and handsome man from the tribe of Benjamin, was anointed by Samuel to lead the nation amid growing military pressure from the Philistines. His primary mission was to unite the Israelite tribes under a centralized command to resist their common enemy. The early years of Saul's reign were marked by some victories against the Philistines. One of the most notable occurred when his son Jonathan, accompanied only by his armor-bearer, launched a daring attack against a Philistine garrison at Michmash. This act of bravery, narrated in 1 Samuel chapters 13 and 14, caused confusion in the Philistine camp, leading to a significant victory for Israel. However, the most famous event of this period was undoubtedly the confrontation between the young shepherd David and the Philistine giant Goliath. The account in 1 Samuel chapter 17 describes how the armies of Israel and the Philistines were positioned on opposite sides of the valley of Elah. For 40 days, Goliath, an extraordinarily tall Philistine warrior, stepped forward from the Philistine army, challenging the Israelites to send a champion for single combat to determine the outcome of the battle. When David visited the battlefield to deliver supplies to his brothers, he was outraged by Goliath's insults against the army of the living God and volunteered to face the giant. Armed only with a sling and 5 smooth stones from a stream, but fully trusting in God's power, David confronted Goliath. With extraordinary precision, he struck the Philistine in the forehead with a stone, knocking him down. He then used Goliath's own sword to decapitate him. This unexpected victory demoralized the Philistine army, which fled in panic, pursued and defeated by the Israelites. Despite this momentary triumph, the rivalry between Saul and David, fueled by the king's jealousy, gradually weakened Israel's position. Saul expended more energy pursuing David than fighting the Philistines. This internal division ultimately had tragic consequences. In a decisive battle on Mount Gilboa, narrated in 1 Samuel chapter 31, the Philistines completely defeated the Israelite army. Seeing his 3 sons killed, including Jonathan, and gravely wounded himself, Saul took his own life to avoid capture. When the Philistines found his body, they beheaded him and hung his body and those of his sons on the walls of Bethshan as war trophies. However, brave men from Jabesh Gilead later retrieved them for a proper burial. David's relationship with the Philistines was complex and went through different phases. Before becoming king, while fleeing from Saul's persecution, David sought refuge in Philistine territory. As narrated in 1 Samuel chapter 27, he presented himself to Achish, the king of Gath, one of the 5 main Philistine cities, offering his services as a mercenary. For approximately a year and 4 months, David and his men served the Philistine king, conducting raids against other regional groups, though he was careful not to attack Israelite territories. This ambiguous situation ended when the Philistines prepared for the Battle of Mount Gilboa against Saul. The other Philistine leaders, suspicious of David's loyalty, convinced Achish to dismiss him from the battle, fearing he might switch sides during the fight. Thus, David did not participate in the battle that led to Saul and his sons' deaths. After Saul's death, David was anointed first as king of Judah in Hebron, and later as king of all Israel. As monarch, he initiated a systematic campaign to eliminate the Philistine threat that had long oppressed his people. In 2 Samuel chapter 5, we read that when the Philistines learned that David had been anointed king over all Israel, they mobilized their entire army to capture him. However, David achieved a series of decisive victories against them. One such victory is described in 2 Samuel 5:20, where David declares, "As waters break out, so the Lord has broken out against my enemies before me." For this reason, that place was called Baal Perazim, Lord of the Breakthroughs. In another battle, following specific divine instructions, David attacked the Philistines from behind when he heard the sound of marching in the tops of the poplar trees, securing another great victory. In 2 Samuel 8:1, we read, "David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and he took Methegama from the hands of the Philistines." Methegama likely refers to an important Philistine stronghold, symbolizing David's dominance over Israel's former oppressors. These successful military campaigns completely reversed the situation. Israel went from being oppressed to becoming the dominant power over the Philistines. The stories of David's elite warriors, known as the Mighty Men, include several feats against Philistine champions. In 2 Samuel 21:15-22, we read about 4 Philistine giants, relatives of Goliath, who were slain by David's men. These victories solidified Israel's military supremacy and pushed the Philistines back to their coastal cities. Under David's reign, Israel significantly expanded its territory and established regional hegemony, which included control over former Philistine lands. This period marked the peak of Israel's power and the lowest point of Philistine influence in the region, a situation that continued under David's son Solomon, who ruled over a peaceful and prosperous kingdom. After Solomon's death, his kingdom was divided into two, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. This division significantly weakened Israel's power in the region, allowing the Philistines to make a partial recovery. However, they never regained the strength they had enjoyed before David's conquests. During the period of the divided kingdom, which lasted approximately from 930 to 722 BC, when the northern kingdom was conquered by Assyria, the Philistines occasionally appear in biblical records, usually as a minor regional power. Their cities were sometimes vassals of Israel or Judah, and at other times maintained limited independence, depending on the relative strength of the Hebrew kingdoms. At certain times, the Philistines formed situational alliances with Israel or Judah against common enemies, especially as the Assyrian Empire began expanding its influence in the region. These alliances were generally pragmatic and short-lived, reflecting the ever-changing balance of regional power. A moment of revitalization of Judahite power against the Philistines occurred during the reign of Uzziah, also called Azariah, in Judah, around 739 BC. In 2 Chronicles 26:6-7, we read, "He went out and made war against the Philistines, and broke down the wall of Gath, the wall of Jabneh, and the wall of Ashdod, and he built cities in the territory of Ashdod and among the Philistines." God helped him against the Philistines. Uzziah not only defeated the Philistines militarily, but also established Judahite settlements in traditionally Philistine territory, expanding Judah's cultural and economic influence in the coastal region. This period marked one of the weakest moments for the Philistines since the conquests of David. The prophets of Israel and Judah frequently included the Philistines in their prophecies of divine judgment against nations that opposed God's people. Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, among others, delivered specific oracles against the Philistine cities, foretelling their destruction and the end of their influence. In Amos 1:6-8, for example, we read, "Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Gaza, and for 4 I will not revoke the punishment, because they carried into exile a whole people. I will send fire upon the walls of Gaza. I will cut off the inhabitants of Ashdod, and the one who holds the scepter from Ashkelon. I will turn my hand against Ekron, and the remnant of the Philistines shall perish." Similar prophecies appear in Isaiah 14, Jeremiah 47, and Ezekiel 25, announcing the inevitable downfall of the Philistine cities. The definitive decline of the Philistines began with the rise of the Assyrian Empire as the dominant power in the Near East. From the 8th century BC, the Assyrians, under leaders such as Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, and Sennacherib, launched military campaigns that subdued the entire region, including the Philistine cities. Tiglath-Pileser III, 745-727 BC, conquered several Philistine cities during his campaigns, significantly reducing their power and autonomy. Assyrian records mention the imposition of heavy tributes on coastal cities, including the traditional cities of the Philistine Pentapolis. Sargon II, 722-705 BC, continued his predecessor's policy, capturing Ashdod in 711 BC after a revolt. This conquest is mentioned both in Assyrian records and in the Bible, in Isaiah 21. In the year that the commander, sent by Sargon, king of Assyria, came to Ashdod and fought against it and took it. Under Sennacherib, 705-681 BC, Assyrian pressure intensified even further. During his campaign against Judah in 701 BC, he also attacked Philistine cities that had rebelled with Egyptian support. Gath, one of the 5 main Philistine cities, was so thoroughly destroyed during this period that it virtually disappears from later historical records. Assyrian domination was followed by Babylonian rule. When Nebuchadnezzar II, 605–562 BC, expanded the Babylonian Empire westward, he encountered little resistance from the weakened Philistine cities. During his campaigns in the Levant, which included the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC, the major Philistine cities were also conquered, and in some cases their populations were deported following the Babylonian policy of forced resettlement. After the Babylonian period, the Philistines ceased to be mentioned as a distinct people in the Bible or other historical records. Archaeological evidence suggests that their distinct cultural identity gradually faded through assimilation with other local populations, deportations, and the growing cultural influence of the empires that dominated the region. This disappearance, as a distinct entity, marks the fulfillment of biblical prophecies that had foretold the end of the Philistines as a separate people. The people who had been Israel's main antagonist in the Promised Land for centuries ceased to exist as an identifiable cultural and political entity. By the time Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire in the 4th century BC, the ancient Philistine cities had already lost their distinct cultural identity. However, the cities themselves, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, continued to exist and flourished under Hellenistic rule, adopting elements of Greek culture. This cultural transformation was profound. The ancient Philistine cities became completely Hellenized, with temples dedicated to Greek deities, theaters, gymnasiums, and other characteristic elements of Hellenic civilization. The Greek language became dominant, and the old Philistine traditions, already diluted by centuries of external influences, disappeared almost completely. Gaza, in particular, became an important commercial center during the Hellenistic and later Roman periods. Its strategic location on the trade route between Egypt and Syria ensured its continued importance despite the political changes in the region. During the wars among Alexander's successors, Gaza changed hands several times, being alternately controlled by the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids of Syria. Ashkelon, the former Philistine Ashkelon, also prospered under Hellenistic and Roman rule. It became a significant port city and, notably, was the birthplace of Herod the Great, who later ruled Judea as a client king of Rome. Herod demonstrated his affection for his hometown by embellishing it with numerous buildings and fortifications. During this period, any remaining Philistine identity was completely assimilated into Greco-Roman and local cultures. The people living in the former Philistine cities no longer identified as Philistines, but as citizens of the dominant empire, whether Hellenistic or later Roman. The Philistine gods were either syncretized with Greco-Roman deities or simply forgotten in favor of the classical pantheon. This complete assimilation meant that when the Romans renamed the province of Judea as Palestine after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 AD, there was no significant ethnic or cultural connection between the region's inhabitants and the ancient Philistines, despite the linguistic similarity between the terms Palestine and Philistine. Over the last 2 centuries, systematic archaeological excavations in ancient Philistia have uncovered important discoveries about Philistine culture and society, confirming and expanding upon many biblical accounts. In Ashdod, archaeologists discovered the remains of a large temple, possibly dedicated to Dagon, which bears remarkable similarities to temples found in the Aegean world. Numerous samples of the characteristic Philistine bichrome pottery have also been found, further confirming the Mediterranean origins of this people. Excavations at Tel Mikne, identified as ancient Ekron, revealed a significant industrial complex for olive oil production with over 100 presses, indicating advanced economic development. A small sanctuary containing inscriptions mentioning Acheron, Ekron, and a dedication to a female deity suggests the continuity of Philistine religion until the late 7th century BC. At Tel Es-Safi, identified as ancient Gath, modern excavations have uncovered monumental structures and evidence of massive destruction, likely related to King Hazael of Damascus's campaign, mentioned in 2 Kings 12:17. The city of Gath was particularly important as the hometown of Goliath and one of the last strongholds of Philistine power. Perhaps the most intriguing recent discovery was the Philistine cemetery in Ashkelon, excavated in 2013. DNA analysis of human remains from this cemetery, dated to the 12th century BC, the early Philistine period, confirmed that the first Philistines indeed came from southern Europe, specifically from the Aegean and Anatolian regions. These scientific findings align remarkably well with biblical records regarding the Philistines' origins from Kaftor. Despite centuries of conflict, archaeological artifacts also indicate significant cultural exchange between Israelites and Philistines. Philistine artifacts have been found at Israelite sites and vice versa, suggesting that despite political and military tensions, trade and cultural interactions existed between the two peoples. A common question when studying the history of the Philistines is whether there is any connection between them and the peoples inhabiting the region today. This question has gained particular relevance in the context of the modern Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where historical terms are often used in contemporary political discussions. The name Palestine does indeed derive from Philistia, but through a complex historical process that does not imply ethnic continuity. When the Romans crushed the Jewish revolt led by Simon Bar Kokhba in 135 AD, Emperor Hadrian, in an effort to erase the Jewish identity of the region, renamed the province of Judea as Syria Palestina, drawing inspiration from the ancient Philistines, historical enemies of the Jews. This name was deliberately chosen to humiliate the defeated Jews by reminding them of their ancient adversaries. However, by the time this occurred, the Philistines themselves had ceased to exist as a distinct people for many centuries. The populations inhabiting the region in the Roman period were primarily of Jewish, Samaritan, Idumean, Nabatean, Phoenician, and Greco-Roman origin, with no direct connection to the ancient Philistines. Modern genetic research has found no evidence of genetic continuity between the ancient Philistines and any present-day ethnic group in the region. The current inhabitants of the area, whether Jewish Israelis or Palestinian Arabs, trace their ancestry to various migrations and populations that settled in the region over the past 2 millennia, long after the Philistines disappeared as a distinct ethnic entity. The use of the term Philistine in contemporary rhetoric regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is therefore more symbolic and political than historical. It represents an appropriation of ancient terminology for modern discussions, without any real basis in historical or cultural continuity. The true legacy of the Philistines does not lie in any modern population, but in the rich archaeological sites of cities like Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza, and Gath, in the artifacts preserved in museums around the world, and of course, in the biblical accounts that document their long and complex relationship with ancient Israel. Beyond historical and archaeological interest, the story of the Philistines offers important spiritual lessons that remain relevant to believers today. In both Christian and Jewish interpretations, the Philistines often symbolize forces that oppose the people of God. Their constant presence on Israel's borders and their repeated incursions represent the challenges and temptations believers face on their spiritual journey. Just as Israel had to continually resist Philistine pressure, believers today encounter cultural and spiritual pressures that challenge their faithfulness to God. The story of David and Goliath, perhaps the most well-known episode of the Israelite-Philistine conflict, has become a powerful symbol of faith, overcoming seemingly insurmountable obstacles. When David declares to the giant in 1 Samuel 17:45, "You come against me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts," he expresses an unshakable confidence in divine power that transcends human limitations. This narrative inspires believers to face their own giants, problems, fears, and adversities with courage grounded in faith. The danger of cultural assimilation, so evident in the relationship between the Israelites and the Philistines, remains a relevant spiritual concern. The pressure the Philistines exerted on Israel to adopt Canaanite practices is reflected today in the many ways that values contrary to the Christian faith permeate modern society. Israel's resistance to Philistine influence serves as a reminder of the importance of maintaining spiritual integrity amid conflicting cultural pressures. Ultimately, the fulfilled prophecies against the Philistines demonstrate divine sovereignty in history. The prophets' pronouncements against Philistine cities were not mere predictions, but revelations of divine judgment against those who opposed God's purpose. The disappearance of the Philistines, as foretold by the prophets, underscores the truth that in the end, God's purposes prevail in human history. The story of the Philistines, therefore, is not merely a record of ancient wars and forgotten rivalries. It's a lasting testimony to the spiritual principles woven throughout the biblical narrative: the sovereignty of God, the power of faith, the danger of cultural assimilation, and the certainty that God's plan will prevail despite human opposition. These truths, reflected in the long saga of the Israelite-Philistine conflict, continue to provide guidance and inspiration for contemporary believers on their own spiritual journeys. If you enjoyed this content and want to keep learning more about biblical peoples and their relevance to our spiritual lives, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Share this video with friends and family who might also benefit from these rich historical and spiritual lessons. Leave a comment below telling us which part of this story you found most interesting, or which other biblical nation you'd like us to explore in our upcoming videos. May the knowledge of God's Word and biblical history strengthen your faith and enrich your spiritual walk. See you in the next video.